Good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Medina, and I'm the co-founder and COO of Results for America. Thanks for joining us for today's session, which we developed in collaboration with our partners at Bloomberg Philanthropies and the U.S. Conference of Mayors. While the enactment of H.R. 1, ongoing federal grant program rescissions, and shifting federal funding priorities are going on right now, city and town grant management teams, like all of you, are operating in an evolving landscape that requires new planning and implementation strategies. And for all of those reasons, our session today will be focusing on helping you build more resilient funding plans and responding confidently to change in this new era of grant making. So let's jump right in with our first speaker. Matt Hansen is the Managing Director of Grants and Policy at Witt O'Brien's, which is a well-known and well-respected risk management and emergency response firm. Matt is a grants management expert with over 30 years of experience at the federal, state, and local levels. And today, Matt will be providing an overview of the evolving federal infrastructure funding landscape and best practices that can help you continue to deliver results for your residents. So at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Matt. Thanks for joining us, Matt.
Thank you, David, and appreciate the opportunity to present today. I'm going to try and move through my material fairly quickly so we can get to this very esteemed panel that we have joining us today. One of these days, I will start one of these presentations by saying things have been quiet in the world of federal financial assistance, but unfortunately, this is not one of those times. Things have been busy as usual. First of all, just want to start with disclaimer that these materials in this deck have been prepared by Witt O'Brien's and myself, and they don't necessarily reflect the views of the U.S. Conference of Mayors, Results for America, Bloomberg, or any other partners. Next slide. So again, lots of activity, executive orders last week, policy directives this week, legislative packages like the big beautiful bill, the first rescission package, et cetera. And all of these have had impacts on our world, both in local government and federal financial assistance in general. Fiscal austerity, increased transparency and accountability, stricter compliance and eligibility requirements, policy shifts. These actions have a common theme. Reviewing current programs resulting in temporary pauses and sometimes not so temporary pauses, analyzing efficiency, policy alignment, receiving consultation and approval from OMB, DOJ, and others to proceed, making these details public. The administration, in their words, aims to hold agencies accountable for their spending and ensure that taxpayer dollars are used effectively. In short, we need to embrace change because change is everywhere and all around us right now. Next slide. So context matters. What's driving this uncertainty? There's all kinds of things driving the uncertainty. On the heels of U.S. Department of Transportation and other recent grant releases, yesterday's posting of 7 FEMA grant programs with an August 11th due date is yet another form of rescission activity by the current administration. Regardless of the use of impoundment, legislative rescission, pocket rescission, or a programmatic rescission, as we're seeing now, communities and grant professionals must be prepared to respond. While the advocacy efforts that are ongoing are critically important, communities must also take action to stay ahead of the curve. Next slide. So the new reality, grant stability is over. This is nothing new, nothing I need to tell this audience, starting with almost the day after the inauguration. The world of federal financial stability is over. This entire transition we're going through right now has been labeled the big shift. The shift of more compliance and financial burdens being pushed down to state and locals. Just today, earlier this morning, the U.S. Department of Education sent a letter to state educational agencies encouraging them to take advantage of waiver provisions in the ESEA and ESSA to improve student outcomes. Um, Last week, HHS talked about a similar approach at the NGA's summer meeting. Um, the big shift and waiver provisions, as are being highlighted, offers huge opportunities, but also comes with compliance and financial burdens that local governments need to consider and be prepared to absorb. Next slide. So why does all of this matter? Local needs are increasing, funding certainty is not. This bulleted list is, you know, uh, more or less a no-brainer, but community needs are growing, local budgets are tightening. We're coming to the end of the ARPA state and local fiscal recovery, which in and of itself will create a certain amount of a fiscal cliff. Um, the good news is the very dire situation that was envisioned with the administration's initial budget proposal, namely a 20% cut of non-defense spending, is now looking more like a 6% cut based on what we're seeing in the House and Senate versions. I know a 6%, only a 6% cut doesn't sound like good news, but compared to what we were looking at with a potential 23% cut, things are definitely trending in the right direction. That being said, a 6% cut with specific program targets is going to have an enormous impact on local budgets, and something that local government needs to get ahead of. Obviously, U.S. Conference of Mayors, National League of Cities, NACO, and others are doing an incredible job of advocating for the reduction of these cuts and the preservation of certain programs. Much of that, improvement from 23% to 6% is directly related to their efforts, hoping we can get closer to zero. But I think at the end of the day, we'll see some sort of cut going into the next budget cycle. Next slide. So all of this being said, now is the time for local governments to take action. I really see as there are five core components that every city should be doing right now. I'll get into these a little bit deeper, but at a high level, inventory your current grant portfolio, conduct a loss funding analysis, analyze your community's federal funding exposure, model potential impacts, and then finally, put some strategic planning and some structure around your grant governments and planning team. What I'm advocating for is really nothing different than most governments do when they're putting together their general fund budget, but putting that same kind of rigor into the federal financial and the grant side of the house. Next slide. So getting into these a little bit deeper, inventory your current grant portfolio. The days of departments individually managing their own grant programs is behind us, or it really has to be behind us. City leadership must know what grants they have, along with the financial and programmatic liabilities. July 24th executive order, the most recent executive order, titled Ending Crime and Disorder on America's Streets, is yet another wake-up call that grants come with special conditions and other compliance considerations that can have enormous impacts on a community. I use the phrase the city is the city is the city, and that's from a federal perspective. Regardless of which department they actually award the money to, ultimately the fiscal agent, ultimately the party that's responsible for compliance and paying back any money that's not spent appropriately is the city. So the days of, well, the police department has their grants and the fire department has their grants and so on and so on, it's really, those days have to be behind us, because you have a management assistant sign on to a group of special conditions. They've now committed the city as a whole to those special conditions. So inventory your grant portfolio is step one. Uh, Next slide. Conduct a loss funding analysis. So the recent focus, rightfully so, has been on those grants terminated and canceled. But communities also need to understand those grant opportunities that they've missed out on. In most aspects, in most regards, the top line number for federal financial assistance is not changing significantly, but the funding is moving from certain types of grant programs to others. Cities need to understand if these are opportunities out there that they are missing out on. They will also need to diversify their grant portfolio. For years, cities have, lived off of a handful of very critical programs like CDBG and Home and others. If we see any cuts to those programs, they're going to have to diversify their grant portfolio. Additionally, the philanthropic community is doing amazing work right now, filling some of the voids. A lot of cities have really only looked at government grants, and they need to think outside the box and look at philanthropic and corporate grants as well. We're seeing a trend with many cities actually establishing a philanthropic advisor position to really look at those non-traditional sources of funding to diversify their portfolios. Next slide. So analyze your federal funding exposure. Last week, there was a collective sigh of relief as the education funding was unfrozen. But the question I have is, are the state education agencies, the local education agencies, any more prepared to rapidly deploy that funding than they were before the freeze? Um, we have this uh, perception issue, which has become a political issue that we need to address with process. When given grant funds for a programmatic purpose, we need to rapidly deploy those resources and report on the outcomes and not give this administration or any administration the opportunity to freeze these funds. So you really need to look at what your federal funding exposure is. You must operate with a sense of urgency in deploying federal financial assistance. Must understand that those programs, which programs are at risk and why. And this is a hard message to hear, but many times the risk comes from within local government and not only from, outside from the federal government. And when I talk about this is, when grants are used not for their programmatic purpose, but for balancing budgets, when there is not coordination with procurement and accounting and HR and others, and certain positions are not approved in time, certain procurements are not done in time. And actually, the reason why funding is not getting deployed is because of the lack of coordination internally, in addition to pressure coming from federal agencies. Next slide. So the next step is really modeling current and potential legislative impacts. And by legislative, it's not only the budgets, additional rescission packages, but the executive orders and everything else that are happening. As we start to understand more about the big shift, this scenario planning is key. In state and local governments, we tend to chase the same grant programs year after year without fully understanding if the cost benefit analysis is still the same. As more programmatic and compliance responsibilities get pushed down, some grant programs might no longer make fiscal sense. We're talking about NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act compliance, Davis-Bacon compliance, even things that we started to see with ARPA, the State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund, where we were having to make our own allowability decisions, our own property disposition decisions. All of this sort of compliance and programmatic responsibility has a financial impact on us. And we need to make sure that it still makes sense to go after certain grant programs. Cuts to other programs might require braiding of additional funding streams, resetting expectations with the public, identifying additional community partners, et cetera. These are all scenarios we need to be actively working through right now. In addition to modeling the various scenarios, local governments also need to be developing mitigation strategies, like recouping indirect costs against grants that were not fully utilized. For those of you that are not familiar with that concept, you have a 2-year window to go back and charge indirect cost against previous grants if there's money left on the table. So if you weren't able to fully spend a grant, if a grant was terminated, et cetera, you can go back and recoup some of that money. On grants you're currently managing, the strategy should be to sever those federal strings as quickly as possible. And you can do that by charging indirect admin, that sort of thing. A lot of the strategies we use with revenue loss, provision of government services with ARPA, some of those same strategies exist with other grants, and we really need to be taking advantage of them. But just playing out scenarios in general so we don't get caught flat-footed. Next slide. And then out of this, establish governance and planning teams. Again, with this final action, I'm not asking communities to do anything any more or less than they are with their general fund budget. Um, if you think about, how budgeting usually works, you work through your annual budget. There are gaps, programs that aren't funded, programs that are not fully funded. And one of the responses is usually, let's go find some grants to plug the hole. Well, the typical timeline for grants is about 18 months from the time of, you know, project identification, notice of funding availability, application, award, et cetera. And you're operating in a 12-month general fund budget cycle. So in many ways, we need to flip-flop those. We need to explore all the third-party options, and then look to see where the general fund layers in. I am a big believer in centralizing grants management, but other models work as well, as long as there's information sharing, consistent policies and procedures, but most importantly, coordination. So, you don't necessarily have to revamp your whole grants enterprise, but you need to make sure the silos are broken down and people are communicating with each other. So what does this look like? I just threw up here a sample real quick with the last couple minutes I have. This is the type of work product that we could see going to elected leaders. We could see going to the public. This is about the hazard mitigation grant program, which is FEMA. Um, Advocacy and decision making without contextual understanding is a waste of time. Again and again, I see statements about how the elimination of the community development block program would be devastating to local communities, but I never hear an explanation of why. As a former local government grant administrator and former recipient of CDBG, I know the why. It would impact projects to supply clean water, ADA accessibility, low income housing, early childhood education, and the list goes on and on. But what is the potential impact to your community so that you can advocate more effectively and make policy decisions to mitigate that impact? So with a sample like this, it's an overview of what hazard mitigation is. Next slide. How mitigation is actually a cost-effective strategy before disasters. Next slide. Background on the actual grant program, when it was authorized, how it's appropriated, et cetera. And then the next slide are actual sample projects, that went through the scenario planning and looked at, the cost benefit analysis, the net benefit to the community, and really allowed this jurisdiction to understand, what the impact would be if something like the hazard mitigation grant program went away for their community, not only with current projects, but if they had future projects or future disasters down the road. So last slide, and I'll just leave you with this, make sure you have a complete understanding of your grant portfolio. That loss funding analysis does not have to be extensive, but really understand where the opportunities are, understand where your community's funding exposure is, whether that be a temporary exposure as programs are delayed, like the education, or more permanent exposure if programs like BRIC go away and never come back. Model those impacts, and then really spend some time, updating your grant strategy, organizing your grants team, and put those various mitigation strategies to work. And with that, I will hand it over to our panel.
Yep, and thank you for all of those really helpful recommendations, Matt, and for the framework that you've shared for cities and towns to prepare for this new federal infrastructure landscape. Uh, I would now like to note for all of you here today that we've developed a grants management strategy guide, which you can all find in the chat. We hope that you'll share this new guide with your teams as you navigate this new fiscal environment. Um, I'm now pleased to introduce Jamie Lavin from Bloomberg Philanthropies Government Innovation Team, who will facilitate our panel discussion in our Q&A session today. Please drop your questions. We'll
Hi,
get to, go ahead, Jamie.
Great, David. Sorry, it seems like we got you cut off for a second. Matt, I thought maybe we take two of the questions that came in that are specifically for you before we get to our panel, if that's all right. The first was about the indirect cost rate, and one of our participants asked about what do they do if they don't have a defined de minimis cost rate, and should they charge the de minimis, and is it okay to change the or to charge the indirect after the end of the project period, going back 2 years?
So if they don't have a established negotiated indirect cost rate, then certainly they can use the de minimis rate, which hopefully people know is bumped up from 10% to 15% now. So it's a pretty significant rate you can charge, and yes, it's a fairly uh, unknown concept that you have a 2-year window to go back and recoup uncharged indirect cost against existing grants. Hopefully, I don't embarrass them too much, but the county of Riverside, California, did this and actually went back and recouped tens of millions of dollars against grant dollars they had left on the table in that 2-year window. So, um, certainly, some programs allow for indirect, some don't, but it's definitely a strategy folks should look at if they're leaving grant dollars on the table.
Great. And maybe just one more before we get to our panel. And it's a question I think a lot of folks might be having, which is we've been heard to hold off on budget and grant amendments right now, so as not to draw unwanted attention to the grants. Yet we are at risk of being out of compliance without the amendment. Are you hearing any updates on this scenario, and should we move forward with the amendment process?
No matter what you're doing, whether you think it's a temporary hold, a permanent hold, you're being ghosted by your federal grant manager because they're under a directive to not communicate, whatever. Do not let your grants fall out of compliance. So if you have a question on property disposition and you're looking for guidance, submit it. If you're don't know if you should submit that next report, submit it. Even if you're not getting, actual payments processed, but you still have the opportunity to submit the request through the payment processing systems, and you have a requirement to do it on a monthly or quarterly basis, submit it. Do not let yourself fall out of compliance. Do not let the grantor give themselves a reason to ultimately cancel your grant. And I can't emphasize this enough.
Great advice, Matt. Thanks so much. And it's a great segue to making sure people know we will be kicking off another round of our grant implementation and compliance boot camp that we'll put in the chat. And so for anyone who has a federal grant right now, I highly recommend signing up for it if you haven't already participated in it, or we bring in Matt's colleagues to give advice about, making sure you're staying in compliance and the different pieces that one needs to go through in terms of implementing a federal grant. And we talk about the fun topic of procurement, which I know is everyone's favorite. So with that, I'm going to move into our panel, and then we'll come back for some more Q&A. Love to introduce Mayor Andy Shore of Lansing, Michigan, Will Tucker, who's the director of the Housing Innovation Lab at the City of Atlanta, and Jim Shannon, who is the city manager's budget director in San Jose, California. So we have a real coast to coast panel of representation. And so maybe just a question that I'll throw out to all three of you to start is, are there specific programs or departments that you're worried are most vulnerable to changes in federal support? And how are you guys planning around that and doing some of the scenario planning that Matt alluded to? I'll start with you, Mayor Shore.
Yeah, I was just going to unmute and I realized you already unmuted me. Yeah, I mean there are definitely specific programs we're concerned about. Yeah, it was discussed that Matt talked about. We look at grants that we get, kind of the year to year versus the additive or the one-offs. The ones that we've been getting year to year, CDBG, home, things like that. We have come to rely on those for affordable housing use. And certainly killing those grants would be a big deal. I had to hit up my freshman Republican congressman, who I served with in the state house, to explain to him how the last time this president was president. We worked with a Republican congressman in a bipartisan way to save CDBG. And it looks like we're there for now, but we will not rest until we're sure. The home dollars being eliminated and then re-added back again, that's dollars that we're using now. So those are the concerns as we try and address the housing shortfall. When you look at some of the additive stuff, we've gotten several grants. We got a grant for EV chargers, an $8 million grant, and we're moving forward. But then we're told, all right, you got your planning grant, but the implementation grant may not be happening. So I'm not going to spend $1 million for planning if we're not going to do implementation. So we get to the big U word, uncertainty. Uncertainty with the grant. We've got a plant here, an assembly plant that for GM that wanted to convert to EV cars. So if you have a Camaro, you bought your Camaro here. It was made here in Lansing, Michigan. If you have a CT5, it was made here in Lansing, Michigan. You're welcome. But the GM wants to convert, and they want to create EV cars. And we got this big grant, $500 million, and now it's up for grabs. So now GM has to decide: do they convert to hybrid instead? Do they not convert? We have a $2.7 billion battery plant, which again, uncertainty. They were going to make batteries for cars, and now with the tax credits gone, they may do other batteries. So this affects jobs. So the additive, the one-offs, they're all uncertain. But the ones that I'm most concerned about are, I'm concerned about all of them, but the ones that certainly we've been using year to year that would create a dent in what we've been doing year to year, that's concerning.
Thank you, Mayor Shore. Just a reminder to everybody, you can still get those tax credits for your EVs if they are put in service by September 30th. So run out and get one of the fantastic EVs that were made in Lansing, Michigan. I'm going to turn to you, Will, to hear about how you all are thinking about this, particularly in the housing space.
Yeah, sure. So just to give everyone a sense of kind of our structure, when the Dickens administration took over about 3.5 years ago, Mayor Andrea Dickens pulled out portions of city planning into a dedicated office of policy within the executive branch. The idea there being to really just marshal our collective resources, not just within the city, but also our partner agencies. So Atlanta Housing, our PHA, Atlanta Beltline, Invest Atlanta, our development authority, and just really focus on seeing the full landscape and getting a little less myopic on our block grants and discretionary grants. And so we're separate and apart from our Department of Grants and Community Engagement, and we certainly are sensitive and have been thinking for obviously months leading up to the election as to how this would affect them in terms of CDBG, home, ESG, HOPWA. We've had to shift gears in terms of a lot of our planning for mixed use, mixed income communities, taking advantage of TIFIA. We've been engaged with conversations with Amtrak for a couple of years now on kickstarting the conversation around a downtown rail terminal in Atlanta because ours is woefully inadequate. And unfortunately, we're having to kind of go in a different direction now that, the uncertainty around TIFIA, RIF seeming to be off the table, the RAISE grants that we've utilized in recent years with a lot of success to fund, our multi-use trails like the Atlanta Beltline around the city. So pivoting there, but I do think, we've tried over the last 3.5 years to kind of lean into our own self-reliance, just so that we could be less vulnerable to some of those kind of uncertainties and just the uncertainty at the federal level. So
that's great. Jim, can we hear about what you guys are doing in San Jose to sort of think about these federal funding realities?
Yeah, thanks. And happy to be here, y'all. Yeah, it's been. I would echo. I think what Andy and William said is the one of the larger challenges is going to be those fundings that are appropriated on a year-to-year basis, but have in the past been more automatic. So things like all the allocations coming from HUD, the workforce investment opportunities that sort of flow through states. Those are things that we depend on a year-to-year basis. And so as we kind of approach the budget process, we really thought about okay, the things that we would count on a year-to-year basis may not be there. Though I would wish we could, easily diversify what those revenue streams are, and look at different pots, and which we certainly tried that and certainly continue that. We have a very active intergovernmental relations team trying to be active. We can't just rely on the federal government, so we do have a generally supportive state government here in California. Do our best to work hard with our regional partners because there is a lot of interagency collaboration that can help with some of these pieces. But we really went into the budget process thinking about, well, there may be, and it's also a little bit not just what funding is formally available, but as the federal government looks to tweak with the terms and conditions of the existing grants, and those that are going to be out there. So you could have been awarded grants, but you haven't executed them yet. And the danger is in how those terms and conditions could be altered by the administration based on sort of their new priorities. And so, thinking through, what programs may need to continue on a slightly risk-based, even though they are formally appropriated and they can still go forward. The practical implications of being able to access that funding may be a little bit trickier than it had been in the past. And so we kind of thought about things in 3 different buckets. We've got our executed grants. Let's go ahead and make sure that we are pulling that funding in on a more frequent basis. Probably a lot of us, we kind of go get our reimbursements maybe on a quarterly basis or sort of a longer period of time. And now we're like, go check that thing every morning at 6 a.m. That funding is in there, grab it, because there was a time there where that funding was not even available. Then there are those buckets where we have been awarded the grant but not executed in those grants. So those projects are on pause until we can get those formally executed. And so we have a sort of cross-departmental working group to sort of work on those items. And then there are the ones that we just started with, which were those formal allocations that we have every year, but the timing of when those are awarded this year may be changed a little bit based on the potential change of the terms and conditions that have always been taken for granted. But if you are a city perceived of as a sanctuary city, or you've got DEI related policies, those are going to be more trickier. And so we tried to set aside some amount of reserve funding as part of our budget process to be able to, if a select few of those don't fall through, like we can't not provide senior nutrition or some other sort of baseline services that act as ongoing services, we try to sort of carve out some space to be able to at least continue those on an interim basis until we sort out some of these other issues.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you all for sharing. Maybe I will ask this question to all of you. What are you doing to diversify your revenue stream? So, Jim, when you just talked about, for instance, those projects that are currently on pause, that we're not sure if the federal funding will come in for, how are you all thinking about pursuing sort of other opportunities, whether it's philanthropic, government, public-private partnerships? And maybe I'll start with you, Mayor Shore.
Yeah, so we are lucky that we have a state government that has been interested in helping out over the last few years. So as we've gotten federal grants, we've also gotten some significant state grants. In the last session, not this year, Lansing got about $130 million from the legislature for a variety of economic development and social programs. That's come to a halt also with divided government in Michigan. So we're looking at all the options. Philanthropy is certainly an incredible option. What I see is that in some bigger cities they have natural philanthropy. In some cities like Lansing, we're a proud working class city. We don't have the random billionaire who's willing to create a philanthropy and then give out money. So we're challenged, but we are talking to a lot of our folks, our community foundation and others, to try and help, but they can't kick in on behalf of the federal government. We're working with our university. We have Michigan State University right next door in East Lansing, which is its own separate city, but we work very closely with the university. We also have University of Michigan, which is in Ann Arbor, about an hour away, but they have a footprint here. So we're trying to expand the footprint of those bigger institutions, whether it's philanthropy, university, working with our state government, doing our best with the federal government, trying to diversify all of that work, and it's working to a point. It's hard to replace the big dollars that were coming from the federal government, but it is working to a point.
Great. And just reflecting upon university partnership, Jim, I know that you guys have a partnership with San Jose State, and just would love to hear about whether that's part of the mix as well that Mayor Shore is reflecting on.
To a certain extent, yeah. I mean, so I think we do have a good partnership there, especially when we've got sort of common assets in. So the San Jose State University is very close to we're right across the street from City Hall here. And so there are obvious opportunities there where we are looking for, economic development items, or they're leveraging what the university brings to the table in terms of its student population, but also its need to access facilities. So we do have several theaters and sporting events and our library, in fact, is where we have sort of joint operations and use agreements for it. Looking to leverage that for one of our outdoor youth stadiums that's going to need some significant amount of capital work, and is going to need some significant amount of programming. That amount of funding available from the federal government for that work was always sort of limited before, and it's going to be even more limited going forward. But maybe there's some opportunities there for some joint development for some areas like that, mimicking maybe something that we have for some of our theaters.
Great. Well, how about you guys? How are you guys looking at diversifying funding sources?
Yeah, sure. So I think we've had the benefit of a little bit of a head start. Even during the previous mayoral administration, when I got to the city in 2021, we were kind of tasked with just leaving no stone unturned, and including some kind of unconventional and creative potential, side quests, looking through the state code to figure out what we could do without getting congressional or state approval. In Georgia, we don't have, unfortunately, the benefit of the very friendly relationship with our state legislature, although we do have some great partnerships with the state itself. So, we've looked at everything from continuing to really lean on our tax increment financing. In Georgia, we call them TADs, and those have been remarkably productive in areas that have seen, acute and concentrated public investment, in just terms of, unlocking and continuing to grow those tax digests such that we can continue to pour investment back into sustained development. We've also looked at, we have the benefit of a housing trust fund locally that comes out of the general fund. It's now fully phased in. It gets 2% of our general fund is allocated. That's about $20 million this year. So it's obviously not enough on its own to accomplish much, but it's been a really great source of leverage for other local public finance and public-private finance, as well as, basically just putting skin in the game such that our local philanthropic partners can really kick in and contribute. Our Community Foundation of Greater Atlanta has been a tremendous resource. We went out in 2023 and issued a $100 million housing opportunity bond to support mainly gap financing for multifamily housing, as well as some single family home ownership. And the Community Foundation kicked in another $200 million through fundraising to leverage that. We also saw the largest single investment in addressing homelessness in the city's history, with a $50 million homeless bond in 2024. So all of those sources have been tremendous, but we're obviously mindful of trying not to strap the city with too much long-term debt service. So, we're looking at being really intentional and creative about using our hotel motel tax, which is poised, we hope, to see a significant influx with the World Cup coming to Atlanta next year. We're also looking at, retooling and updating for the first time in decades our fee schedule for occupation tax, right? So that businesses are paying more of a fair share that goes into the general fund and can be deployed to fill some of these gaps. And lastly, we've looked at special service districts have been helpful here. And in Georgia, you have wide kind of latitude for your local jurisdictions, city council, to go ahead and approve those without, getting approval from X percentage of property owners, things that you typically run into with a community improvement district or a business improvement district. So that's been very helpful as well. And I would say, beyond kind of just going out and looking for money wherever we can for the general fund, in terms of just kind of institutional capacity building. I think that has been really immeasurable in terms of making us more resilient to volatility at the federal level. So just having all of our local public partners, including our transit agency, our housing authority, all kind of rowing in the same direction, and collaborating on what we call a housing strike force, has been really instrumental in terms of just making sure that we are not just finding every dollar we can, but really deploying those to maximal use. So, and lastly, I would just say utilizing our public land resources and, finding opportunities where there's kind of that untapped public land where we can really put it to highest and best use in service of our affordable housing needs and sort of in service of, addressing deficits in fresh food access. That's really just been the kind of third key piece to this whole equation for us.
Such a good point you've made. I know a lot of cities are looking at their assets and their footprint and thinking about how to leverage those. Has that been part of your thinking, Mayor Shore or Jim, in terms of ways to also, find some additional funding?
Absolutely. We're turning over every couch cushion, every stone. I think every city is. We really don't have a choice. But yeah, we're kind of looking at all new options, and we're looking at the grant funds that we do have that we've received and how do we use those. We started doing a few years ago into the pandemic, we started leveraging admin fees, and we hired grant writers. So that was one of the more clever things that we were able to do that we hadn't been doing in the past, is you take your 3%, 4%, whatever you take for admin fees, you hire a grant writer, you pay the grant writer to go out and get you more money for different grants. And as you've heard, looking at philanthropy and private grants, it's how we leveraged more money than we expected to with the bipartisan infrastructure law. It's how we have done things with the IRA. It's how we're applying for a variety of state grants. We're adding a second person. I think having the capacity for we're a city of 114,000. We're not Atlanta, we're not San Jose. A little jealous, gentlemen. But we're leveraging every dollar that we can to try and make it ninefold, tenfold. If we can bring those dollars here to the Midwest, to what is generally a purple state where federal governments usually want to invest, then we're going to do that. So we're gonna, if you have a couch, we're gonna turn over the cushions and look for those pennies and nickels.
Great. And just maybe one last question. I don't know if you've all experienced this, but I assume Mayor Shore, you're at least thinking about it. Is how to communicate with residents about some of these impacts, where Jim was talking about you can't not be feeding your population, right? And thinking about the cuts that you might need to make on more discretionary items to be able to sustain the necessaries. How are you thinking about messaging that to residents and maybe even involving them in the process of thinking about where to trim the budget?
Well, sure, blame the federal government. Easy, isn't it? Right? Doesn't everybody wants to blame the federal government? No, we are doing that. Again, we knew going into this process when ARPA passed, as part of the U.S. Conference of Mayors, as a part of Bloomberg, we knew, and we told people, right, don't make this year over year, don't make this sustainable, because the money won't be sustainable. ARPA is a one-time thing. So we were very specific. We bought some fire trucks, right? We had some fire trucks that were still in use from 1996. They were old. We had ambulances with 200,000 miles. We put one-time funding in so we could show the bright, shiny new thing, but not so that we had a firefighter year over year that we had to then lay off. But we are talking to our community in town halls, through city council, social media, just talking about the opportunities that we had, that we took advantage of, that are not necessarily there. We encourage people to talk to our federal officials, our senators and congressperson. We encourage folks to talk to our state government and remind them that Lansing needs funding just like other cities in Michigan. So I think we have done a good job of prepping people from the start of, we're not going to take this money and add 10 police officers and then lay them off. Although we actually did, we got a SAFER grant through fire. We were able to add something like 17 new firefighters. But again, we said we're adding 17, but they're gonna, as attrition happens, we're not gonna be replacing through attrition. So we got a one-time bump of EMS services that we need with increasing calls. And now we're trying to figure out how do we replace, and if we can't, we're gonna lower through attrition. So again, we've been very upfront on all of that. And I think that our residents, they certainly want to see more. They want to see, Michigan Avenue just got redone with a federal grant. They want to see that in every other corridor. But we can explain that it's federal dollars. I put it in every one of my state of the city addresses. We put the amount federal government, state government, and then what your tax dollars are getting you. You're getting a certain amount for roads every year. But in terms of the fire trucks or the one-time grants, that came from federal government. I think being upfront with your citizens is important on that.
I mean, if I can just add on to that, which is really good communication effort there. I also, we try to focus. It's so hard to break through, especially in the budget. Budget is, to be honest, to most residents, is really boring. We all love it here, but it's boring to most folks. But there are some, key advocacy leaders or groups that are always really engaged, advocating for whatever issue they are working on. And so, to the extent that your budget process has elements where those folks can't engage or get information about it, just being super upfront with where it's at. In San Jose, we have this process called the manager's budget addendum process, which is an MBA, we call it, which sounds sort of, dorky and bureaucratic, but folks know that there's good information in there. And so we put out one of our MBAs, MBA 3033, sort of just highlighted what the federal funding risk was. Says, hey, we've got this funding out there. We might not get all of it. Here are the approaches that we are taking for it. Here are some examples of things that might go away. I don't expect any of my friends to read it, any of the people who aren't really engaged in it, but I know that those folks who are actively lobbying their city council members, the mayor, are reading those and are going to key in on those. Not that that's the answer, but that is a piece to make sure that they understand that there's not unlimited resources for the city to combat all these issues.
That's great. From some recent polling, we saw often that residents believe that everything is within, the mayor or the city council's control, and don't always understand the jurisdictions. So breaking that down can be really helpful. I'm going to bring Matt back into the conversation for some of the questions that we've got. If you have questions, please add them to the chat. I've been loving seeing the robust dialogue that's happening there. And thank you, Matt, for getting some of those answered while we were in conversation. I think there's some questions in here that I'm going to ask, even though I know there's not a good answer for, just to help us all with approaches. I know this is a time of great uncertainty, as Mayor Shore said. One of the questions we got is, how can we anticipate to confirm what programs, especially BIL, appropriate to FY26 will continue versus cut off for the remainder of 2025 and 2026? Matt, do you want to take a stab at that?
The short answer is you can't. I will argue, though, that you don't have to wait on a notice of funding availability to put together project information. Too often the NOFO, the application is released, and that starts to clock, and we start sprinting, pull information together. What we're seeing with these reduced timelines is that's almost an impossibility right now. You can't put together a quality application in 2 weeks. So jurisdictions really need to be thinking about this differently. At the time you have an infrastructure need, a programmatic need, start pulling all the information together, start getting the data, start doing the stakeholder engagement, pull everything together. That BIL or other NOFO might happen, and you're already prepared. It might not happen, but 3 months from now, 6 months from now, another grant opportunity comes along and you're prepared. And even if there's not a grant opportunity, you can use it for, a general fund request. You can use it for bonding purposes, tax incentive purposes, having discussions with third parties about partnership. I would argue that the hardest thing to do with any development of grant application is pulling that program project specific data. So if you really, that's where you should be investing your energy now and not worrying about what funding opportunities are going to happen and what's not going to happen. The other thing I just wanted to highlight here for a minute is what Mayor Shore shared. Grants should pay for grants. And if you're using either admin funds or indirect cost recoverables effectively, that's really how you should be reinvesting in your grants enterprise and not making it a drain, a burden on the general fund. So I know it's easier said than done, but cities are going to be looking at cost cutting measures here over the next 18 months, 2 years. Those people, whether it be a philanthropic advisor or your grant team or the management assistant or whoever is responsible for bringing in third-party funding, that's not where you want to cut right now. And you need to come up with funding strategies in order to support those positions.
Hey, Jamie, something that Matt said really struck a nerve with me. One thing that we did a few years ago, we sat down with our cabinet and we basically asked them all, what do you need? We put together a book for our public service department needs, this for wastewater, our fire department needs this, our police department needs this, our planners need this. We literally put together a book of all needs from the exciting economic development, 28-story tower to literally emptying the digesters and how do you get in our wastewater. We put together a book and then we made it plug and play. We said, state grants, there's a grant from our Department of Health here, federal grant, and we literally would just take a piece of that book that qualifies and then get whatever other info we needed and play. So that was tremendously helpful. When Matt talks about kind of these last minute grants, we know we get emergency management grants, and when FEMA rolls out a 5-day grant, we can apply for that. We've got that information. We're ready to go. And we did it because we really didn't know what we needed and we wanted to assess. So doing that assessment of need with our cabinet really was very helpful in order for us to be able to plug and play whenever NOFOs would come out or whatever, the administration would say, hey, keep your eye out because on August 13th, there's going to be something coming out. And you all know, we've all been in those meetings where they say that. So we've been really very prepared because of that kind of that playbook.
Yeah, no, that's a great practice, and developing a playbook and then prioritizing, right? Like what are the things after everyone comes back with their wish lists, are the things that are the most important to devote those limited grant writing resources to. And just just to give everyone some peace of mind, as opportunities emerge or as new funding streams come online, we'll be providing, quick turnaround help for those. We've been, in conversations with the folks at USDOT, and they've told us that, Build and Safe Streets for All and the stage 2 of SMART and Rail will all be coming. And so we're developing programming now to help everyone get ready for those. We don't know exactly what the NOFOs will look like, but with Safe Streets and Roads for All, we've now gone through one cycle in the current administration, and we're able to provide sort of comparison guide for folks who may have applied in the previous administration to think about what modifications they might need to make to their project or to their application to be able to comply with the new administration's criteria. And so it's not a fully full answer to your question, but I will just say that as things come out, we'll try to make resources available. We also got some questions, and I put information in the chat. Last week, we hosted a session on the impacts of HR 1, especially on the clean energy tax credit. So I encourage anyone who missed that to check it out, or at least check out the resources we published, because as I noted, there's some deadlines coming up soon. So don't want to miss out on those funding streams. Another question that we got from Luann Martinez: do you have a link to credible information or a recipe on how to recoup administrative fees? Matt, any suggestions there?
Recouping indirect cost fees. So just to clarify, they're two separate things. So most grants allow for an admin fee, typically 10% or so. And then there's an indirect cost recoverable. You have programs like actually the state and local fiscal recovery where you can charge both. As far as credible information on recouping indirect costs, National Grants Management Association has a one-pager on it. Most of the accounting firms, Baker Tilly, Moss Adams, Cherry Beckert, anybody who's in the federal financial assistance space, they have whole pages on their website devoted to it. And then obviously the source document is the Federal Uniform Guidance and their section on indirect cost.
Great. Last question. I think this one, feel free, anyone who's going through this now to jump on. How are municipalities handling reimbursable grants and those with cash matches or funding gaps in the current fiscal environment? Jim, I might look at you.
Yeah. So I mean, we try to make sure that, when we have a reimbursable grant, well, one, that we've got the local match funding available. So we try not to apply for grants unless we have the match funding available. If you're trying to stack grants and you're trying to use some federal for some other piece, that could be problematic. I would say, make sure that you are first making sure taking care of the basics, like getting the funding when it becomes available from the federal agency for the reimbursement. I touched on that earlier, but because the people maybe aren't actually at their desks in the federal government, your contact has maybe just been laid off. And so there's really just some gaps there in terms of who's available. So checking your portals on a regular basis. But in terms of trying to allocate some different funds, I mean, one opportunity, like Matthew was saying earlier, when you're doing your inventory of your grants, there could be some opportunities where that some of these other grants are not going to be available, but you've had that cash match stashed over there. Take the opportunity now, if that's not going to be available, reappropriate that into a more flexible funding pot to be able to use that to have a match for a different piece, especially if you're using your general fund, which not a lot of us do, but some of us do use the general fund as a small amount of match, depending on what the grant programs are. And so to the extent that you can have your most flexible funding sources be available for your grant match, that gives you the flexibility to then reallocate that match to sort of a different grant program.
Matt, do you have anything to add? Thought that was spot on. Thanks, Jim.
Yeah, I would just, one of my earlier comments was sometimes the problems are within your organization and not at the federal government. Drawing down is one of those. People hear the term on a reimbursement basis and they think literally money has to be out the door before we can submit a request for reimbursement. The federal concept on reimbursement is not only money you've spent, but also immediate cash needs. So you can have an invoice in hand. That invoice has net 30 terms for payment, whatever it is, and you can draw down that money before you've actually, paid the money yourself. So really have a conversation with your accounting and finance folks about how to tighten up some of those windows and some of those cash flow so that you're not getting way out ahead of a federal grant that might suspend drawdowns or be terminated altogether.
I'll also add, look for soft costs. If you can use soft costs, we do that with a state grant where we had a grant match. We were already building a $27 million performing arts center, and the grant was for a district. We said, hey, we're already putting 27 million in. Does that count as the grant? Does that count as the match? It counted as about half of it, and after that they wanted hard dollars. So then we had a Parks millage where we had grant match that we had dedicated. But if you can reduce any of that grant match with soft costs, do it.
That's a great point. A lot of folks are intimidated by the whole concept of in kind, and it's there's a lot of document. It's this, it's that. It's really not. And so whenever you can pivot away from cash match to an in kind match, you absolutely should do it.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much. I really appreciate all of the time and strategies that you've given today. This is an easy topic, and we'll be continuing to support folks. And please do answer in our poll if you need some time with Matt or anyone else on our team to be able to talk about the different strategies that your city can use. Don't be shy in asking for some assistance. So I'll turn it back to David.
Yeah, let me join Jamie in thanking all of our panelists for all these great recommendations. I especially was struck by the develop your needs playbook now. Don't wait for the NOFO. So keep that in mind. And as Jamie mentioned, please fill out the Zoom poll. Please let us know if you need some one-on-one technical assistance. We'll also be offering free in-depth grant application and implementation training this fall for the grant programs that you see on your screen. You can register to attend a boot camp or a workshop via the QR code on your screen or the link in the chat. And just a reminder, our boot camps are multi-week cohort-based programs that guide cities through full application development processes. And our workshops are intensive half-day sessions focused on targeted grant-specific trainings. So we are here to help in any way we can. Please complete the poll. Please let us know how we can help. And don't forget to check out our website for everything you heard here and in previous sessions, localinfrastructure.org. So thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time.